All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the AmSECT webinar, Building a Center of ECMO Excellence, demonstration of interdisciplinary collaboration. We'll have presentations by Elizabeth Moore and Ben Swanson tonight. And then I wanted to mention that we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So please utilize the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions. And then finally, an evaluation survey will be sent out immediately following the webinar tonight.
Okay, thank you, Kelsey. My name is Bill Dubois. I'm AmSECT president. I thank everyone for joining us tonight, taking time out of their schedule to learn a little more about ECMO. AmSECT's one of our missions is education, and ECMO is on the tops of our list for education. Also, right now, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge George Putnam, the passing of his son. His son, Spencer, passed away a couple weeks ago. George was an AmSECT member, or is an AmSECT member. He was on the board of directors and always an actively engaged person. I was friends with George, and he was the kind of guy that I didn't see him much, but every time we reconnected, we always had a good time. And his son Spencer was the same way. So just take a moment to acknowledge that. Okay, thank you. So tonight, our topic is on ECMO, building a center of excellence, and we're very fortunate to have Justin Sleesman. Justin was our AmSECT Perfusionist of the Year. He's out in Stanford University at the Lucile Packard Medical Center. Justin will be primarily leading most of the topic today, and he has two other speakers, Ben Swanson from out in Oregon, and Elizabeth Moore from the University of Iowa. Again, thank you for joining tonight, and Justin, go ahead.
Bill and Kelsey, thank you for the introduction. Good evening and welcome to AmSECT's third webinar regarding extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. The first two webinars on cannulation and circuit selection can be found at amsect.org. Membership is not needed to access, reference, or provide feedback on ways to continually improve this educational series. Like they said, my name is Justin Sleesman. I'm a perfusionist at Lucile Packard in Palo Alto, California, and a current ELSO steering committee member serving as our perfusion liaison for AmSECT. Now, it is my personal opinion that the success and readiness of an ECMO team is greatly dependent upon the interdisciplinary collaboration of non-MD healthcare professionals. Predominantly nursing, perfusion, and respiratory therapy provide the backbone of care for patients in need of extracorporeal life support. Now, in contrast to cardiopulmonary bypass, which is a defined start and end or problem and corrective solution, taking place over a few hours or perhaps a long day, ECMO support occurs, as we know, in various areas of the hospital, involves complex intra and inter-hospital transport, and requires the highest level of critical care for weeks on to potentially months. The use of ECMO has seen exponential growth over the last decade, as indicated and documented annually in the ELSO registry. In 2018, in the US alone, 228 ECLS centers provided over 8,000 ECMO runs. As the evolution of bypass in the 1950s and the role of the perfusionist went from on-the-job training to graduate level studies with certification and credentialing, the role of the specialist, I believe, will continue to take shape as ECMO is currently under their microscope and how a center provides foundational ECLS education and training to provide this life-saving technology. The Joint Commission and Center for Medicare and Medicaid are, I'd say with a heightened emphasis, looking at institutional baseline education, simulation, staffing, and certification requirements to be an ECMO Center of Excellence. A recent AmSECT article titled, "Is Our Current ECMO Training in Schools Sufficient?" by Jesse Montoya, I think put words to what seems to be a common theme on making the transition from a student at a perfusion program to a prepared and educated clinical professional on an ECLS team. Now, whether you're a nurse, respiratory therapist, or perfusionist, I believe that the ECMO curriculum needs to be enhanced in training programs. To this end, I reached out to 2 programs, specifically the Medical University of South Carolina, their perfusion program. This spring is going to be offering a 13-week standalone ECMO course, so I congratulate them. And in similar fashion, the University of Iowa now offers an ECMO course to their nursing students in their critical care curriculum. And my hope is that this trend continues and we see additional programs be early adopters of ECLS education to prepare their prospective students for the growing world of ECMO support. Now, with that said, this is a perfect segue to introduce our 2 invited speakers who possess varied educational backgrounds. This is collaboration of nursing and perfusion, but serve in the ever-evolving role of ECMO coordinator at their respective institution. Elizabeth Moore is the Associate Director, Clinical Functions at the University of Iowa and Vascular Center, and a current member of the ELSA Education Committee. And second up, we'll have Ben Swanson, who has vast experience as an ECMO coordinator and serves as our AmSECT Zone 2 Director. Like Kelsey said, please submit your questions during the presentations, and we reserve the last 15 minutes of this 60-minute webinar for an audience to panel question and answer session. I'll now turn over the webinar to Elizabeth. Liz?
Thanks, Justin, and thanks to Kelsey and Bill for getting us started off tonight. I'm really excited to be able to be here with you all this evening and be able to talk to you guys about some really exciting topics. So hope you all enjoy. Without further ado, I'll jump into my slides. Bear with me for 1 second. All right. As was covered briefly there, I'll be starting off this evening discussing what could be considered kind of the 2 most despised topics in healthcare to frontline clinicians. We're going to talk about the finances and talk about the Joint Commission prep and readiness. I hope by the end of my talk, you'll at least have a newfound appreciation for why these topics are so vitally important and successful to an ECMO program. Once I conclude, I'll pass it off to Ben, who will be taking a deeper dive into education and assessment of competency. So, to start off, why is it so important for clinicians to understand the finances of healthcare? We can keep thinking that this magic healthcare money tree is going to exist, or we can face reality. You can't turn on the TV, open a newspaper, click on Twitter without seeing headlines regarding the rising costs of healthcare. Healthcare spending is projected to grow faster than the economy, increasing from 17.9% of the GDP to 19.4% of the GDP over the next 10 years. Government health programs like Medicare and Medicaid will account for about 44% of the total healthcare spending in the US economy. So these high healthcare costs can not only be detrimental to the economy's well-being, it can reduce the amount of resources to our nation and the families that we have to invest in our future. So in the American Medical Journal of Ethics, the concept of no margin, no mission, and many of you may have heard this concept, but there's a bit of an identity crisis occurring. Is hospitals a business focused on profit margins and the bottom line, or are they a mission-driven public resource working to improve health of the community? And are these 2 roles diametrically opposed when they look at each other at first glance? The response to this question is, this concept of no margin, no mission. In other words, if a hospital doesn't make enough money to keep its doors open, its higher purpose is moot. ECMO's no different. If we can't make enough money to support this high resource, high dollar technologies, hospitals are going to be forced to make the tough decisions regarding whether or not to keep their programs open. So I'm hoping that this isn't news to many of you on the line here, but on October 1st of 2018, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services abruptly made some changes to the codes and DRG reimbursements for ECMO to a much lower reimbursement. ECMO historically fell into 003, and effective last year, what they looked at is they moved all peripherally cannulated patients into 4 separate DRGs. Many of the peripherally cannulated DRGs would fall into what was then reassigned to DRG 207, and DRGs being diagnostic related groups. And what the bottom line of what that meant is that the DRG is where the payments or the reimbursement amounts came from, and that was going to be roughly about $35,000 reimbursement for this peripherally cannulated patients. Of note, DRG 003, where all of our historical patients have mapped to, had a base reimbursement of about $105,000. So you'd be seeing almost a $65,000 decrease in reimbursements for peripherally cannulated ECMO. So this obviously came to be a very controversial decision, and as many of those ECMO key stakeholders raised the following issues that I think are important for people to kind of recognize what happened in that ruling and what came about of it. So there was issues because there was a lack of opportunity for public comment on the DRG reassignment. Patient access to ECMO treatment programs became highly at risk with inadequate payments. And then CMS did not appear to have enough patient data to really look at those changes. So it kind of felt like it came out of nowhere in there. This was based on advice from a consultant that CMS was working with. And what the comments were out there saying that, they were likening it to ECMO to a balloon pump for cardiac failure or a mechanical ventilator. So there was some theories out there saying, ECMO is so easy, we need to change how we're reassigning these. So then a study published in the Journal of Heart and Lung Transplantation, a single site, I believe out of Chicago, posted, what was this bottom line going to be? So if these changes that were enacted in October of 18 would have stuck, what they did is looked at retrospectively their patients in 2016 and 17, and their reimbursement was calculated by applying a national average dollar amount for these patients. And what they found is when the changes went into effect, this roughly to a single hospital was going to be a loss of anywhere from $1.2 million to $3.3 million based on this change. So I know I keep throwing this concept of DRG. Why does that matter? We'll realize that if the cost of your care is less than the payments you receive, you are profitable. And a lot of times, I get those questions of, how do we know, I'm being questioned that my program is profitable or not profitable. It's very simple math to do, and that is that your costs have to come in lower. A lot of these different programs have DRG-based payment systems. And so whatever DRG you fall into for those DRG-based payment systems, that's the reimbursement that's going to be tied to. It's not all bad. Policymakers search for ways to control healthcare costs and improve quality. And these DRGs are by far the most important cost controlling and quality improvement tool that the government uses. And as well, a lot of times what you'll see is that government policy will go into place and then private payers will soon there follow. So this was a pretty large change that came about in 2018. What ended up happening is, and AmSECT being one of the groups, and also came together and petitioned and sent letters to CMS, and using some of our registry information from ELSO to be able to demonstrate the detrimental causes of this change. Luckily for programs, and luckily for many of us who ECMO is near and dear to our heart, the CMS did reverse those changes and reverted everything in October of this year. So, I'm sure many of you are saying, okay, well, why did you tell us about this if all this has been reversed? It's my opinion and opinions of others that as we start to talk about this, they're not going away. CMS will probably come back at some point in the near future and try to figure out ways to do cost containment around ECMO. So it's very important for us as clinicians to make sure that we're being mindful and being educated on how these decisions are being made, and being very mindful of listening to when these decisions are going to be made, so that we can do so in a way that is being a good financial steward of healthcare spending, but it's doing so in a way that we know and can help control which direction it's going. So how can, as frontline clinicians, how can I share with you, if I gave you a finance 101 lesson, there's a few different things that if I really want to simplify it, there's things called direct costs, there's things called indirect costs, and there's a term of depreciation. So with the time I have tonight, I'll kind of go through at least those topics that I think have bearing to what you guys can do in your programs. Direct costs are expenses that go directly into providing your service being into providing ECMO. Examples of what direct costs could be are labor costs. So how much does it cost to pay for the people that are responsible to your ECMO systems? Material costs, so your ECMO circuit, your disposable circuit, that as well is a direct cost. There's also indirect costs. I will mention these, but these are a little more tricky to navigate. It's things like utilities. It's things that the general business expenses that keep you operating or keep the hospital operating. So that's keeping the lights on, the utilities going. That is administrative costs like who's going to pay for your billing department. So those are the kind of things that I would consider indirect costs associated with doing the business of healthcare. There's also a term, depreciation, which it's a accounting convention that allows companies to write off an asset over a period of time. I mentioned this one because, as you start talking about the cost of doing ECMO, things like an ECMO pump, if an ECMO pump is going to cost an institution $100,000, they're not going to take that $100,000 hit in that first year. They're going to say, you know what, we expect this pump to last 10 years. And so they're going to divide that $100,000 cost over the next 10 years. And that's going to be a cost that's incurred on a yearly basis and spread across time. So, as I mentioned, I think it's hard to get into the indirect costs. Indirect costs are really what the cost it is to keep the lights on and keep the hospital going. I think for those closest to an ECMO program, you have the most influence over the direct costs. This is where the medical directors, the coordinators, really can focus their time and energy in dissecting, is there anything more that we could be doing to make sure that this is a cost-efficient way to run our ECMO service? So that's things like your personnel, your staffing models, evaluating whether it's on a yearly or every 3 year strategic process to say, do your volumes support the staffing paradigm that you currently have? Or is there a reason to say that we need to change what we're doing in terms of who are the people on an hourly basis that are there taking care of the patient? Circuit design, so consumables. Do you really need that new shiny toy, that new system that came out? Will it truly increase value and safety or efficiency to care, or is it just the latest and greatest and it would be really nice to have? How much are you paying for your circuit? Having that moment where you do shop around and decide, if a lot of things are made equal, what is important and imperative to have and which one things are nice to have? Are there cheaper alternatives out there that are available? And I think it's also having those discussions too with the providers of, there's a lot of discussions of those patients that go through the sequela of they failed a balloon pump and then they went to the Impella and then they went to ECMO. You got to really start thinking about, as those devices start adding up, you're only going to get one payment for those patients. And the more you use, the more it's going to cost. And again, I'm not remiss, as a nurse and as a bedside specialist for many, many years, I understand that, how we provide care and what decisions we make, I understand that those can't be at the forefront of the dollars and cents, but in a retrospective way, I think that those that are really in charge of the program need to be thinking through those elements and deciding what makes the most sense for our program and how do we stay financially viable. So a real-time approach to thinking about the staffing paradigms. So this was a single site review or a publication that came out of Thomas Jefferson. And what they really did look at is a cost reducing ECMO, where they really looked at their single site experience. So this was a new program implemented in 2010. And it consisted of a dedicated ICU multidisciplinary team that came together to really look about what they could change or morph to try to decrease the cost of providing their service. So in year one, what they did is they introduced a new educational platform. So the perfusionists helped to develop a robust training program for those clinicians that were going to be continuously at the bedside. They got new technology. So I believe what it was is that they moved away from the Biomedicus to a Rotaflow system and dedicated space. So they cohorted their patients in a single ICU. In year two of looking at their program, what they did is they had the perfusionist move away from the bedside, be available by call, and started to empower through new management algorithms, designing this multidisciplinary provider team to really just be the frontline nursing teams at the bedside to be managing the day-to-day, minute-to-minute issues that arise. So during their study period where they looked at this, they had 47 patients, and the total annual hospital expenditure for the ECMO program was significantly reduced looking at the comparisons of year 1 and 2. What they were able to show with changing their staffing paradigm was a 61% decrease in cost. And on top of that, what they were able to also show is they did not have any significant changes in nursing ratios at the bedside or have any outcomes, any negative outcomes related to ICU events. So they were able to safely and efficiently change their staffing paradigm and reduce costs. A couple of things that I did pull out of the study to have note is they got rid of all access points in their circuits when they changed their platform, which included they did no pressure line monitoring pre or post oxygenator. All cannulas were inserted peripherally. So just a couple points of note when I was going back and looking at some of the specifics of what they did. So moving on, beyond the finances to the other wonderful topic of regulatory visits. So if you can imagine sitting in a room of about 50 hospital leaders, it's day 2 of a hospital's triennial Joint Commission visit. The plan for the day is being discussed, and the surveyor, one of the surveyors, quietly raises his hand and says, you know, I'd really like to change what I'm going to do today. I'd like to look at an ECMO patient, and I would like to review the credentialing related to ECMO. So since you're the ECMO coordinator, all eyes immediately go to you. This is not hypothetical. This was me a couple months ago when the Joint Commission came through for our hospital-wide survey. And on day 2, the reviewer said, I wanted to see ECMO, which, you know, thankfully, my plan, I came prepared. I'm very passionate about education and very passionate about constantly revolving and looking at our program and making it better in any way I can. So I did feel very comfortable. However, you know, what do you do in those scenarios, right? So Joint Commission's there, they want to see what's going on. So what do you do? So do you fake an MI, which I somewhat thought about in that moment, to fake a major catastrophe. You know, I did have thoughts of starting to frantically text the bedside and ask them if the patient could come off like in the next 5 minutes so that we could just say, no, there's no ECMO patients here. That wasn't possible. You know, what do? Do you go for the hide your drinks and hopes that's all that they care about? Because I know that that's typically the first thing that when the reviewers come around, everybody runs around and covers their drinks. But I'm sorry, that tactic won't work. They want to know about more than just your drinks. And so what do? You know, you take a deep breath, you realize you've got this. And I hope to provide with you for the next couple of minutes some hints into how you can do some of your Joint Commission prep so that your answer can also be, take a deep breath, you've got this, no problem, let them see anything they want to see as it relates to ECMO. So part of, you know, how you can reframe this is understand, listen, Joint Commission certifies and accredits over 22,000 healthcare organizations and programs in the United States. They got a lot of land to cover, a lot of places to go, you know, and really their goal and their mission is to work with healthcare organizations and inspire them to, you know, excel in providing safe and efficient care of the highest quality and value. So their job is to help make sure that we're taking the best care of patients possible. So even though, you know, they can come across as a very daunting and scary organization to be coming into your doors. They're there to help, and they're there to make sure that we're doing everything we can for our patients. So where do you start? The Joint Commission determines the highest priority patient safety issues and how best to address them. So number one, if you don't know these, the hospital's national patient safety goals are a wonderful place to start. So you can look at these and say, how do these tie back to our ECMO program? Some of these may not have direct ties, but you'd be surprised a lot of them actually do. So if you take, for example, the first section regarding identifying patients correctly, what is your process for blood administration? Of course, you're basically chained to that bedside. So I'm sure some of you are thinking, how do you mess up and give the wrong patient the wrong blooded product? But that's not the important part. What the Joint Commission wants to know is, can you articulate what you're doing to have safety nets, ensuring that you're giving the patient the right drug or the right blood product in the moment? So it's impressing upon your team. I know that the processes at the bedside can sometimes seem overdrawn, right? So scan the ID, scan the IV pump, scan the blood bank bag. But keep in mind the foundations of this process are to keep the patient safe. And so really making sure that you as a clinician really understand why these processes exist. I think the other piece in this is also making sure that a member and the voice of the ECMO team is present when hospital policies are being drafted. Workflows at the bedside of an ECMO patient have their own unique challenges. So ensuring that you have representatives of the teams at the committees where these policies are being created are very important to make sure that you have policies created that are not going to be impossible to follow for these patients. Joint Commission is there to see that you have a policy in place and that you're following it as it reads. So another hint for success is know the plan for the Joint Commission. They almost always provide templates for their planned itineraries for their visits. So your compliance or accreditation point of contact or your accreditation officer in your institution will have this. They will know where they plan to go, what they plan to look at on a day-by-day basis. So if you don't know that person, tomorrow might be a great day to introduce yourself so that you can better prepare and think about, when are they coming next and what would be their plan of what they want to look at. So another piece that I would say, if you like checklists and you want to say, okay, that's great, but what else can I do as a deep dive into our program? There's a tool available on ELSO's website. It's under the Award of Excellence, but what it is a toolkit to kind of navigate the major headers in which you can really examine your program. So those major headings being physical facilities, equipment maintenance, staffing strategies, policy and procedure adherence, quality management, and training and competencies. So for those, what it does is it asks you a series of questions that'll just do a good job of kind of jogging your thoughts of, do you have for facilities and equipment? That would be like, do you have a designated backup system in the event of emergency, and where is that? How do you ensure the safety of all ECMO patients in the event of an equipment failure? Under staffing, it's, what does your staffing model look like? How do you determine the staffing requirements for ECLS patients? For policies and procedures, for that one, I would say that it's, write a policy that's just one part of the battle. You need a system to ensure that you have adherence to that, an auditing system to that. So that would be, if you say that you have a policy related to sweep management that says you're going to go up by a liter per minute of sweep for increased CO2 above target, and somebody adjusts by 0.5, you are opening yourself for a citation by not following the letter of the law and what your policy states. So the good news, and as I'm navigating what some of these questions are and why I'm not necessarily giving you the answer to the question, the Joint Commission isn't going to come and say you're wrong if you say this is our staffing strategy. What they really want to know is, what is your process? Can you speak to it? Do you have evidence behind why you're doing what you're doing? Have you used clinical practice guidelines or evidence-based practice to kind of prove why you're approaching it in that way? That's what the Joint Commission wants to see. Do you have a policy? Do you follow it? And do you have strong evidence to support why you're doing what you're doing? So with that, the last one, which is a beast all in of itself, training and competency. I've really saved that topic best for last. and could be hours of discussion, but I know Ben's got a nice wrap up in that to really talk about what you need to be thinking about in terms of training and competency. This, I would say, beyond equipment and patient staffing, training and competency verification is the other huge topic that Joint Commission is going to spend a lot of time wanting to better understand how you're making sure that your team is prepared and ready for whatever may come your direction. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ben.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Liz. Great job. Usually we have the best presenter go last, but all right, I'll try to do my best here. I'm going to talk a little bit about training and competence here. So a little bit, just a brief explanation from my standpoint is I'm a perfusionist that worked as an ECMO coordinator. I recently switched jobs, but for over 5 years, I was the ECMO coordinator at the University of Kansas Hospital. And kind of how I came to doing that is we started an ECMO program doing one ECMO and really didn't have anybody to champion that. And so I championed a training program, created a training program for ECMO specialists and built that up. So I'm going to kind of talk about that today. Like Liz said, we could spend hours on every single one of these, but we'll try to do the short and sweet of it. I'm going to just kind of overview how we determine staffing. Like you said, if the Joint Commission's coming, this is our way that we justify our staffing. Talk about creating protocols, competency, developing that training course, and then implementing competency. Kind of questions that you want to ask is, are you currently part of an ECMO program? Is this something you're saying, we're a perfusion base, we want to move to a specialist base, we're overwhelmed, we like the way we're doing things, or we want to retool it and make it better? Or are you completely starting from scratch and want a better understanding of how to create a training and competency? Good questions is, who is going to be your specialist? Is this a perfusion staff? Are these ICU nurses training as specialists, respiratory therapists, combination? You know, most likely if you're a small program or you're just starting doing ECMO, that's usually heavily relied on the perfusionist to kind of be the champion to start that. And then as the program grows larger and staffing becomes a problem, we start to use the ECMO specialist as an ICU nurse or respiratory therapist and move into that direction. Or maybe your hospital has already decided that they want to start a specialist program before they move to an ECMO program. You know, your staffing model is really going to depend on the volume, your resources, and equipment available. If you plan on doing 6 ECMOs, or you plan on doing 100 ECMOs, or you're doing 100 ECMOs, your resources, how much money you have for training, equipment, and the equipment available. You know, how many ECMO pumps do you plan on having? How many runs do you do at the same time at your hospital? Does that include a backup pump? So it's going to depend how many staff you have. And really, all drivers of a competency will be determined. So if your perfusion staff is 6 and you're going to start doing ECMO, your training and competency is going to look a lot different than training 50 ICU nurses to become ECMO specialists. So I'll do a little review of how we kind of came to the idea of our staffing model, just for a baseline if you're interested. Also kind of defines an ECMO center as somebody that's a minimum doing 6 ECMO cases, that they're financially responsible and they're doing it in a safe manner. But really our staffing depends on how many runs you're going to do at your hospital at one time or any given time. What we came down to looking at, we like to use a 12-hour shift model just because it's a lot cleaner. As you do smaller shifts, it just requires more people to do that. But we felt that we needed, obviously there's 14 12-hour shifts per 7-day work week. So we need around 5 specialists to staff that. And then to avoid burnout. And that doesn't account for time off, so we add on to that. So let's just say you're a 6-person perfusionist team and you want to start doing ECMO. You're probably properly staffed to do around 6 to 10 ECMOs a year. But as you start to build that program, you're going to have to think about adding staff or creating a specialist program. So what it really came down to, we call this a mixed staffing model. we would say the number of specialists for us needed to equal the number of ECMO runs we did per year. And this formula seemed to work out really well. It allowed us to have staff always on. It kept staff numbers appropriate, so we kept people competent in doing their job. There wasn't too many people trained. There wasn't not enough people trained. We could run multiple runs at the same time for weeks on time if we wanted to. So what I mean by mixed model is ECMO is not your primary job. So your primary job is an ICU nurse and respiratory therapist, or your primary job is a specialist, but you're working as an ECMO specialist bedside when you have ECMO patients. Now, full-time staffs for centers that have dedicated staffing, say you're a perfusionist and you work just ECMO shifts, you could cut those numbers in half or even more, but that's really going to be up to the resources and availability and things that you have at your institution. So protocols and determining competency. And the reason why I'm talking about protocols is because it's a lot easier to know, develop a training plan for everybody if you know what you want your specialists to know. So not everybody, if you're a perfusionist and you have a baseline or good understanding of extracorporeal circulation, you're starting at a different point than an ICU nurse is that doesn't have any experience with ECMO. So a really good way to do this is to start simple and work complex. Like you were saying in the JCO visit, looking at equipment and how you manage it and take care of it and use it. Easy to start with a knowledge base of that system, referring to manufacturer's recommendations and going through those in cleaning care protocols and developing the simple basic needs for equipment use and safety. But I'll also go to say that creating protocols also is a great resource for this. You go to resources in patient care practice guidelines. This is just an example. There is tons and tons and tons of information that can tell you and show you and give you an idea of an example of how to develop protocols, an idea of how you should do things, and really is a really good reference. When you say, how do I justify what we're doing? You can go to this and say, this has been established data. So how do you determine competency in your institution? Well, this is one way we did it. So we need to identify what you need to know to be competent. And so what we had was this system where we used a priority scale and a frequency scale. And the reason why we did that, we took 10 ECMO runs and we really just logged everything that an ECMO specialist did the whole time. And we kind of created how frequent things happen and what was the priority of fixing that. So on a priority rating, we gave it a 10 rating is if you didn't do anything, the patient would likely die. So let's say if the pump failed and you did nothing, the patient would die. 1, if no change or you didn't do anything, they likely have 0 impact on survival. And then we had a priority. If something was done greater than 10 times a day, then it was a 10. If you didn't really do it, it never happened, it was a 0. And we example that on the bottom, like pump failure. It was a 10 and a 1, it was a score of 11. Well, we initially took the first top 10 of that, and then we found the 9 seemed to be a better topics. And what we found for determining core competency is, so any specialist, and that's perfusionist, whoever's taking care of ECMO at our institution, and we can go back, if somebody asks, well, how did you determine competency? That's the formula in science we used it. But this is, just so you know, this is what we found was, as a minimum to be a competent specialist, was titrating PO2 and CO2, being able to circuit check safety of all the equipment, understanding preload and afterload issues on centrifugal pumps, managing venous line chatter and understanding that and identifying it, knowing in VV recirculation, arterial mixing or north-south syndrome or the Harlequin syndrome, coding a patient on VV ECMO, knowing and understanding oxygen failure, and managing what happens during pump failure and how to work through that. So I know we're moving through this fast because there's a lot of information, but now that you kind of have an idea of your protocols, you have an idea of what you think is competent, individuals need to be competent, you can start building a training plan. What I think is a really good resource is to become an LSO member, order the training materials they have. The Red Book and the ECMO specialists are awesome tools to use to help develop a new program or really retune your own program. I also like the idea of setting out a couple individuals if you have the resources to do an outside training program. It gives you a really good baseline of how to set up a class, the flow of the class, regimen of the class, and all those different things you can take back and you can kind of retool to your own individual protocols, pumps, equipments, etc. Another thing to think about is how many individuals you're going to be training at any given time. Is this something that you do one class a year and you're training 5 people, or are you training 20 people at a time, multi-times a year? Obviously, there's an idea of there's the benefit of creating your own plan versus outsourcing. Outsourcing is expensive, but I think is needed sometimes. You can actually have companies and institutions come into your hospital and train everybody. It's very expensive, but if that's the plan you want to take, that's the plan you want to take. Again, ELSO offers so many resources to help you develop your own training program. If you go to resources again and go under the Center for Training Guidelines, and if you go under ELSO Guidelines for Training and Continuation, you will see that there's all these different pieces of step-by-step process, bulleted programs to show you how to develop your own ECMO training program, and it's really good. So now that you have an idea of how you want to do your class, you have the stuff, you need to start developing your class. You set the framework, the classes, develop the PowerPoints, use the resources you have available to develop those materials. It's a really good idea to recruit interdisciplinary subject matters like intensivists, surgeons, anybody who can talk about things that we can kind of spread the wealth of knowledge and creates depth for your class. Create course evaluations and feedbacks. With SurveyMonkey is really easy to do that kind of stuff. Also, an added benefit is if you can do it, creating CEUs for your course, it adds another layer of depth and value to it. And it really, most importantly, has to be recreatable and interchangeable. This is something that needs to be able to, if you're doing this quarterly or 2 times a year, that it's the same product over and over. Granted, you're going to be adding to it or making it better, but you can plug and play different people. So implementing the training plan. So you need to find space for the class and secure what best fits your needs. If you're going to have 25 people in your class, you're not going to want to do this in a break room or a small conference room. You're going to have a room that has really good AV, audiovisual space to have equipment in to go through scenarios. I would highly recommend getting a high fidelity simulation system, although low fidelity is good if that's all you have. But using that, having the space in the room to do that, and really create it so far in advance that people can really put this on their calendars. That if perfusionists on your team are teaching classes, that there's on the schedule so other team members aren't taking time off. So when it comes time for the class, they don't have to be in the OR, that they can be presenting. Keeps it professional. Again, following up with feedback and surveys. So I will kind of take a look at what this all looks like together. This is what our experience with this, but if you're going to combine creating a training program and putting together that with competency, this is what it would look like. So initially, a specialist going through a training program would go through an institution and pass the relevant exams, oral and written. Also recommends this as a 24 to 60-hour course content. That they also complete a knowledge-based exam of a wet drill, preferably with simulation they're evaluated. And before they actually are specialists, they must complete 8 to 16 hours of supervised bed training care of ECMO on VA and VV support by an experienced specialist, and be checked off that they are competent to take care of those patients. We also have them and we use a bedside nurse and an ECMO specialist, a 2-person model. We try to keep them with the bedside nurse that is a ECMO specialist as well, to kind of help them through those first couple runs after they've been checked off. So you have a trained specialist that's now in part of your pool that's managing ECMO patients, take care of them. What are you going to do to have competency? For us, we complete an annual wet lab simulation competency where they have to be able to demonstrate that they can manage those 9 scenarios with oral testing. Unless the specialist spends less than 8 hours bedside in a 3-month period, and our ed unit coordinator does a great job tracking that, we'll go back and assess whether, at our discretion, whether they need to do further training or refresher course. That can be, I think also recommends, or Liz might know better, but every 8 weeks or something like that, you should be taking care of an ECMO patient. But I think the main important is that you have a plan and that's what you do. So implementing competency-based in your needs really comes down to some things. So how busy are you? How often do you need to do competency? If you're a really slow program, competency is going to be needed assessed more often for people who aren't getting the hours behind ECMO pumps. When do you want to reevaluate it? Is it an annual, quarter, or monthly, depending on what you do and what you're offering? And who determines competency? Is that the ECMO coordinator? Is that a perfusionist? Is that a unit educator? Depends on how you're going to define that. And how is it documented and where is it stored? It's not very difficult to create competencies documents that basically demonstrate this is the day we did this. This individual was able to demonstrate that they could manage and identify these key scenarios, that they passed the knowledge base equipment test on an annual basis. That's documented, that the ECMO coordinator documented the competency, that they signed it, and that's put into their employee file. So final points to remember, just to keep us on time. Determining on ECMO runs, that can be hard. You can be a hospital that says, hey, we want us to do ECMO, you got 4 perfusionists, and we're saying, oh, I don't know how to do this. But get an idea. If you've never done ECMO and you're just gonna start doing it, sometimes you've had consults here and there, you can kind of idea where you're gonna be. Number of specialists you're gonna need to train. If you're gonna be a perfusion-based program and you're gonna be doing less than 10 ECMOs, then you need to know how many, if you have enough perfusionists on staff. Then you're gonna determine your protocols and competency. You're gonna create a training plan and implement it. Once you have specialists trained, you're gonna perform resident competencies, however you do that. And then you're really, what's I think is really important is you communicate and document what you're doing, what you did to determine it. Like I said, there's no right answer to this. The more important part is this is what we believe it is. This is why we believe it. Here's how we do it. Here's where we document it. And this is where it's stored. And as long as the specialists, when they're asked, well, they know that, yes, my competency is every year, and I have to do identify these clinical scenarios in simulation, and that's checked off by our ECMO coordinator on a yearly basis. So I know that was a lot of information really quick, but I appreciate your time. Thank you. I think we can open it for questions now.
Ben and Elizabeth, thank you for your presentations. Well done. I just want to start with a comment too about Joint Commission, how it really seems to be a hot topic. They're really digging into ECLS. Our experience, Liz had, it sounds like a little bit of a warning. She was in a meeting. We were giving more warning. They said they're coming to your center and they are specifically going to be looking at your ECMO program. They let us know. It was very invasive. We had Joint Commission for a week, followed by CMS directly the week after. And while we think like, oh, no big deal, Joint Commission, as you know, when they actually come physically to your hospital, everyone is heightened, everyone is stressed out, they're already busy with their clinical duties. So I think that the point is, make sure to prepare for Joint Commission visits, because I think that ECMO, it's been a bit loose, I think, on regulation, and they're definitely digging in to make sure that we're all doing a great job, so I would do that. I want to take the first question. This is going to be posed to Liz here. We got one here, and it says, how involved, the first question is, what are the 2 most cost-effective DRGs to submit under, talking about finances and reimbursement for ECMO? Now, if I'm right, Liz, I think it was DRG 006 versus DRG 003 was the difference. Is there 2 DRGs that are most cost-effective?
You know, it really, 003 is where they're all going to land. It reverted back on October 1st of 2019, so a couple months ago. So any and all ECMO patients, nothing will trump that ECMO DRG other than if you have a patient that goes on to a transplant. So ECMO is a bridge to transplant. Then it reverts to 001, which will go up to a transplant, a higher paid DRG. So right now, everything falls through. If at any point there's a CPT code that says ECMO, it'll be in 003.
Thank you. And I think also on the regulation too, is that they're not just focusing on, they want to go to Liz and talk to the ECMO coordinator. They're focusing on everyone too. I'm staff, and I spent 60 minutes in an interview with both of the surveyors. So same with our scrub nurse, our circulating nurse, everyone took time, 60 minutes to talk with the surveyors because that was requested. So I think it's important for the ECMO coordinator to lead, obviously, but everyone needs to be prepared to make sure that their certifications are complete, their training is complete, and they're ready for a Joint Commission survey visit. My next question, let's see here. I'll take another one from the audience. How involved were your ICU pharmacy specialists in your ECMO programs? Ben, I'll pose this question to you. Do pharmacists become involved kind of in the, let's call it the initiation of ECMO? Or are they kind of a all-encompassing force for the duration of the ECMO support?
Not so much in the initiation part, but they're definitely part of our interdisciplinary rounding. So there's, you know, the rounding team that rounds through the ICU is probably like, there's probably 15 people that are on that team. And we have a dedicated pharmacist in the ICU at all times that rounds on that. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, they're pretty integrated with the care of the patient.
No, I think it's a relevant question. We've seen definitely more pharmacists designated to that ECMO circuit kind of, or in the unit on a daily basis beyond just the initiation. So we're seeing a lot more pharmacist input at our institution. Liz, I know you said there's no template for kind of preparing for a visit from the Joint Commission, but is there anything that you were caught off guard or thought you could improve, or a different approach that you would have taken to kind of share with the audience?
Yeah, I think actually you hit on it, Justin, is what I've found, and every surveyor has their own style, if you will, but they really didn't want to talk to the managers or the ECMO coordinator. They wanted to talk to frontline staff in a lot of their walkarounds in the units. And so for me, you know, I feel like as the ECMO coordinator, I knew the answers and I knew where to guide things. And so I think that as we kind of head into our next phase of survey rounds, it's making sure that those frontline staff members really understand the answers as well, because that's who they want to talk to.
Hey,
Liz, here's one. In that study, the Jefferson study, what was it, Cavaraci?
Yep.
Although they said the patients did just as well, mortality was 60% in the low-cost group and 40% in the higher cost group. And they had, what, 2 decannulations. So those are significant events, and, you know, be hard to tell a family, well, we saved money, but they didn't turn out okay, you know. And also, if you look at that study, the costs were very low, like $800 for an ECMO set.
Yep.
Most people maybe, and that comes to another question. Are there standards for ECMO equipment? Because with CMS, for an LVAD, you have to use a Centromag or such, an approved device. You couldn't just use a Biomedicus pump to run an LVAD. Do they have that for ECMO yet?
No,
You know?
everything for ECMO, to my knowledge, is off-label use. So there's not a standard set. And in fact, manufacturers cannot say that it's for the use of ECMO. So I agree. I think that cost of $800, I think they used a perfusion service company, and that's what they were charged out at. So
Okay.
for any of us who have to purchase disposable sets, we know that you can barely get a pump head for $800.
Yeah.
So I wasn't really sure how they got lucky enough to have those charges in there. But, you know, to my knowledge now, no, there's not a standard ECMO set. In fact, you know, everything is still 6 hours of use.
Yeah, the other one is, with survival expectations for ECMO higher now, when you're setting up a program, how do you handle for a faster response time for initiation of ECMO? So is everybody in-house, or do you call people in? Ben, what do you?
You know, you're talking about like a shock team, that it's a team that's prepared to put somebody on ECMO immediately. I think if you're going to do that point where you have to, I think you'd have to have 24-hour staff. We developed a shock team, but it wasn't a response to be in the ER. A faster response to be in the cath lab if somebody was brought in and there's intervention going on. So, but not from CPR to ER to ECMO or ECLS circuit. But I think if you're doing that, your response time would have to be less than, 15, 20 minutes from the standpoint of the person getting there. And that's having surgeons in house, or somebody who can cannulate in house. What's that?
There was another one. How do you check for the physician credentialing, like their competencies? Any experience with that?
We do at the University of Iowa have 2 different tracks for physician credentialing. So we have a cannulating physician credentialing as well as management physician credentialing. Management is very similar to what Ben kind of went over and what we would expect to see a ECMO practitioner at the bedside. There's elements of didactic content that they need to cover and prove that they've been through a training program. There's proctored management of a certain number of patients that they need to work alongside a credentialed managing physician before they're signed off. And then there's continuing education that they're required to do on an annual basis. For cannulation, it's similar fashion, except for it's proctored cannulations of various types with a cannulating physician. So we do require both here.
Here's one. Were you all familiar with that AmSECT's offering a certified ECMO specialist exam at the international meeting, and that's for perfusionists, ECMOs, well, whoever operates as an ECMO specialist, nurses, respiratory perfusionists, even physicians. So that's something to look forward to that AmSECT can offer.
Hey, Bill.
Justin, any other questions?
There's a couple questions, Bill, that I think are good questions. I think we have just enough time. There was one talking about staffing. I believe it was how many people you can staff at one time. Yeah, it says, at your institution, do you allow perfusionist ECMO specialists to be responsible for more than one ECMO patient? And how many patients can they ever be responsible? I know there's probably really busy programs where one person can manage several patients. With our institution, doing 25 to 30 ECMO runs a year, we really don't feel like one person's competent to do all that and run the bedside. So we have a one-on-one model where we always have an ICU nurse with a specialist on that.
Okay.
If we don't have a specialist available, we'll have an ECMO specialist. I really think that's the best model. I think it's a very acute, it's a lot of high acuity there. A lot of things can happen fast, and I think it's the best way to manage ECMO patients.
Okay, so we have about a minute left to go. So I know Elizabeth wanted to answer that, but we'll have to get back to that at another time, just with respect of everybody's time. So just to know, other modules in this ECMO webinar series is on ventilator management with blood gases management, complication and safety management, transport, and I believe that's the last one, but those 3 to 4 more. And lastly, again, there's a survey you'll need to complete to get your 1.2 points from the American Board of Cardiovascular Perfusion for the perfusionists. And I thank everyone for joining us tonight. Have a great and safe holiday season and a good evening. Thank you. Thank you, panelists, as well.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Ben.
Everyone.
Thanks, guys.